Ever feel like the world of political systems is just this bewildering maze of jargon?
Hmm.
One moment you're hearing about authoritarianism, the next pluralism, and then totalitarianism. It can feel, well, overwhelming just trying to keep it all straight. And maybe more importantly, trying to understand what these terms really mean for how societies function, how power is held, how our daily lives are actually shaped by these big ideas.
Yeah, the labels can sometimes obscure more than they reveal.
Exactly. So today we're taking a deep dive into a stack of really fascinating sources that lay out the core concepts defining different forms of governance and societal structures. Think of this as your essential shortcut to being truly well informed. We're aiming to cut through the complexity and hopefully give you those clear, resonant aha moments.
Precisely. Our mission today is to distill the most important nuggets of knowledge from these materials, helping you not just define, but truly understand the foundational ideas behind various political and economic systems. We'll explore their definitions, sure,
Yep.
but also their historical significance, their practical applications in the real world, and even their surprising overlaps and contradictions, because, let's face it, the world is rarely as clear-cut as a textbook definition.
Right, reality is messy.
Mm-hmm.
So whether you're prepping for a big meeting, maybe catching up on a complex field, or just incredibly curious about how the world works, buckle up. We're about to make some pretty dense topics incredibly interesting, hopefully, with facts and connections that might just surprise you. Right, let's kick things off with systems where power is, shall we say, less distributed, more centralized.
Okay.
And first up, we have a concept that sounds, well, very dramatic: absolutism. What exactly does it mean for a government to be absolute?
Okay. Absolutism. At its core, it's the theory or practice of absolute government.
Hmm.
And that means it possesses um, unfettered power.
Unfettered power.
Right. This government cannot be constrained by anybody external to itself. No courts, no parliament, no popular vote can truly check it. Now, while its most prominent historical manifestation was indeed the absolute monarchy in, say, 17th and 18th century Europe,
Yeah.
and you think of Louis XIV of France.
So the sun came, yeah.
Exactly. But it's crucial to understand that it's not exclusively tied to a single monarch. Our sources clarify that theoretically, this unfettered power could even be vested in a collective body.
Oh, interesting. Like a committee.
Yeah, like a supreme legislature, perhaps.
Yeah.
As long as it faces no external limits, it could technically be considered absolute in this sense.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit more. So it's about power that knows no limits. But how on earth did the proponents of such a system even begin to justify it? It seems so counterintuitive to, modern sensibilities.
Well, the justification for absolutist rule is actually twofold. It drew on both rational and spiritual arguments.
Hmm.
First, you had rationalist theories, put forward by influential political philosophers like Jean Baudin and Thomas Hobbes. They argue that only an absolute government could guarantee order and social stability.
Order and stability, that was the key.
That was the key. They truly believed that any divided sovereignty or challengeable power was just a recipe for chaos, civil war, a brutal existence, Hobbes's state of nature.
Right. Nasty, brutish, and short.
Exactly. So their logical conclusion was a single, unchallengeable authority was the only way to secure peace. Then second, there were theological theories, famously based on the doctrine of divine right.
Ah, yes.
Here, a monarch's absolute control over subjects was seen as deriving directly from God and sort of analogous to God's power over creation.
Wow.
This gave their rule a sacred, unquestionable legitimacy. It meant rebellion wasn't just political dissent, it was, well, blasphemy.
That's a powerful set of claims. But if it's absolute, how does it really differ from, say, a modern dictatorship or totalitarianism?
Yeah.
They also sound pretty absolute in their control. Where's the nuance there?
This is where it gets genuinely interesting, and where our sources provide a really critical distinction. Absolutism differs significantly in its scope and its ambition.
Scope and ambition. Okay.
Right. While absolutist regimes aspire to a monopoly of political power, primarily by excluding the masses from politics.
Keeping people out.
Right, keeping them out of state affairs. Totalitarianism, on the other hand, takes it much, much further. Totalitarianism aims for total power by politicizing and controlling every single aspect of social and personal existence.
Every aspect.
Every aspect. So
Okay.
absolutism isn't the same as fascism, for instance. An absolute monarch might control the state, demand loyalty, suppress direct political opposition, sure. but they generally don't seek to dictate what you read, what art you produce, or what you talk about at your dinner table, or how your private economy functions.
They leave the private sphere
Mhm.
mostly alone.
Mostly alone, relatively speaking. Totalitarianism invades that sphere. It wants to dictate those things.
So it's about control over the state and politics, but not necessarily the entirety of life. Okay. Given that distinction, what does this all mean for today? Is absolutism just a historical relic, something we only read about in history books?
Well, in its traditional monarchical form, yes, it's largely regarded as politically redundant and, frankly, ideologically objectionable in most of the world.
Hmm.
The historical advance of constitutionalism and representation has deliberately fragmented power, strengthened checks and balances. And where dictatorship has survived into the modern era, it's generally assumed a different character, which we'll get into.
Uh-huh.
Ideologically, absolutism often serves as a cloak for tyranny and arbitrary government. And it is, by definition, fundamentally irreconcilable with ideas like individual rights and democratic accountability.
But I sense a but.
However, here's a surprising insight from the sources.
Yeah.
The underlying concept isn't entirely gone. A form of constitutional absolutism can still be seen in political systems based on the principle of parliamentary sovereignty.
Like in the UK.
Exactly like in the UK. There, Parliament theoretically holds supreme, unchallengeable legal authority. In a purely legal sense, within its constitutional framework, Parliament's power is absolute.
Huh. That's unexpected.
It is. It makes you wonder. How absolute can a system truly be if it still operates within a clear framework of rules and, democratic processes? It's a reminder that even in modern democracies, there can be these deeply embedded legal principles of, unchecked power within specific governmental branches.
That's a great example of how these terms aren't just old textbook definitions. They can still resonate and even surprise us today.
Definitely.
And building on that idea of concentrated power, we also have authoritarianism. This sounds quite similar to absolutism, but our sources indicate it's a much broader category. What's the defining characteristic here?
You're absolutely right. It is a very broad classification. Authoritarianism is essentially a belief in or practice of government from above.
From above, meaning?
Meaning, political rule is imposed upon society regardless of its consent. That's the key. It emphasizes that authority is not derived from the will of the people. And crucially, it differs from simple authority, which rests on legitimacy and arises from below. It's earned or agreed upon. Authoritarianism, in contrast, is imposed.
Got it.
Our sources note that it can be associated with monarchical absolutism, traditional dictatorships, most forms of military rule. And what's interesting is that both left-wing versions, often linked to communism, and right-wing versions, which can be linked to capitalism, exist. It highlights its broad applicability across the ideological spectrum.
That really clarifies the imposed aspect. And you've mentioned totalitarianism already. How does authoritarianism in this broader sense draw a line compared to the totalizing reach of totalitarianism? What's the key difference in their approach to control?
Right. Authoritarianism is usually distinguished from totalitarianism because its primary concern is the repression of opposition and political liberty.
Stopping dissent.
Primarily, yes. Rather than the radical goal of obliterating the distinction between the state and civil society, this means authoritarian regimes may tolerate a significant range of economic, religious, and other freedoms.
Oh, okay. They don't necessarily control everything.
Not necessarily. They want to maintain political control, suppress any form of dissent that threatens that control, absolutely. But they don't necessarily seek to dictate every private thought, every artistic expression, or every economic transaction. They aren't usually trying to create an entirely new human being or totally reshape society from the ground up, which is often the ambition of totalitarian regimes.
So it's less about a pervasive, all-encompassing ideology and more about simply suppressing dissent and maintaining the status quo, or at least a particular political order.
Generally speaking, yes. Maintaining control is paramount.
What about its historical significance, and how does it show up in modern manifestations?
Historically, authoritarianism was the dominant political form in pre-constitutional and pre-democratic societies. Think monarchical rule, aristocratic privilege. That was the norm for centuries.
Right.
Thinkers like Joseph de Maistre, for instance, argued strongly for authority over individual freedom as the only way to secure order. That reflects its long-standing justifications. In modern politics, it's viewed as distinct from both democracy and totalitarianism, though the term's value is sometimes limited because authoritarian regimes, while relying on command and obedience, exhibit such a wide range of political and ideological features. It's a very diverse category.
Our sources also talk about old versus new authoritarianism. Can you elaborate on that? How does that distinction help us understand its evolution?
Certainly. Old authoritarian regimes, think Franco's Spain, were often quite conservative. Their primary aim was to protect traditional elites and actively depoliticize the masses.
Keep them quiet, basis.
Exactly. Keep them out of political life.
Yeah.
In contrast, new authoritarian regimes, often found in the developing world, focus more on things like economic mobilization. And to some extent, they rely on political agitation and popular appeals.
So they try to engage the population more.
Sometimes, yes, but in a controlled way. They might even develop what the sources call authoritarian populist features. This could resemble Bonapartism, after Louis Napoleon in France, which fused personal leadership with conservative nationalism, or Peronism, after Juan Perón in Argentina. That was a dictatorship based on support from the impoverished masses, with promises of economic and social progress.
Interesting. So it adapts.
It adapts. It shows the evolving nature of authoritarianism, integrating elements of popular appeal while still maintaining that top-down control.
What really stands out to me here, and it's quite a surprising fact from the sources, is the idea that authoritarian traits can actually be found even in regimes we label as democratic. How does that manifest?
Yes, that stark authoritarian-democratic distinction can indeed be quite misleading, because authoritarian traits can absolutely be identified even in systems we generally call democratic.
Like where?
Well, examples cited in our sources include the McCarthyite witch hunts in 1950s USA. That was a period of intense anti-communist fear, leading to aggressive repression of perceived political subversion, often bypassing traditional legal norms.
Right, the Red Scare.
Exactly. Another example mentioned is Thatcherism in the UK, with its blend of neoliberal economics and neoconservative social policies. Some interpreted this as a form of authoritarian populism, meaning a strong, centralized executive with popular appeal, but one that was willing to bypass or marginalize traditional institutions and dissent when necessary. And beyond the purely political sphere, authoritarianism has also been viewed as a psychological phenomenon,
Oh, how so?
linked to either a disposition to obey orders unthinkingly or, conversely, a rigid insistence on obedience from subordinates. Adorno and his colleagues, in their famous work on the authoritarian personality, explained this as an extreme intolerance to ambiguity, possibly a response to deep insecurities driven by uncertainty and the burden of choice.
Wow, so it goes deep.
It does. And makes you wonder, doesn't it, how much of any political system is about top-down control imposed by leaders versus how much is shaped by inherent human tendencies or our responses to broader societal pressures and anxieties. It suggests the human element plays a really profound role.
That's a fascinating connection, stretching from individual psychology right up to these big political systems. Okay, now let's zoom in on a concept often confused with authoritarianism: dictatorship. What's the strict definition here, and how does it specifically relate to the others we've discussed?
Okay, dictatorship. Strictly speaking, it's a form of rule where absolute power is vested in a single individual. It's essentially synonymous with autocracy.
One-person rule.
Basically, yes. Historically, it was associated with unrestricted emergency powers granted to a supreme magistrate in the early Roman Republic, a sort of constitutional dictatorship meant for limited crisis period.
Right, like Cincinnatus.
It's exactly. But in modern usage, dictators are seen as being above the law and acting beyond constitutional constraints. More generally, it's characterized by the arbitrary and unchecked exercise of power. Whether it's the dictatorship of the proletariat in Marxist theory, a military dictatorship where the armed forces rule directly, or a personal dictatorship centered on an individual leader holding all the reins.
So it's really about an individual, or sometimes a very small group, holding concentrated, unchecked power. How does that then relate to the totalitarian regimes we discussed earlier? Is every dictator totalitarian?
No, not necessarily. A key distinction is drawn between traditional dictatorships, which primarily aim to monopolize government power and conform to authoritarian principles by repressing opposition.
Like the authoritarians we just discussed.
Exactly. And totalitarian dictatorships, which seek that total power and extend political control to all aspects of social and personal existence, aiming to politicize everything. Our sources list classic examples of dictators: Sulla, Julius Caesar from Rome, Cromwell in England, Napoleon Bonaparte, and then more recently, figures like Hitler, Stalin, Saddam Hussein. It illustrates the breadth and, let's be honest, often destructive nature of this form of rule.
And here's where it gets really interesting for me. The idea that modern dictatorships often link to charismatic leadership and this powerful, almost mystical idea that the leader embodies the destiny or the general will of the people. How does that actually play out?
Exactly. This is a crucial element that allows them to gain a kind of veneer of legitimacy, however thin. Totalitarian dictatorships in particular can even try to masquerade as perfect democracies and gain significant popular support, crucially by strictly controlling mass communication and manipulating information.
Controlling the narrative.
Completely.
Mhm.
This is how they project an image of popular will, even while systematically suppressing it and eliminating genuine dissent. However, it's also important not to overemphasize just the personal aspect of individual charisma. Most modern dictatorships are either military dictatorships or operate through a monopolistic party.
So the institution matters too.
Right. The unrestrained power truly lies with the armed forces or the deeply entrenched party-state apparatus. Sometimes leadership is shared by a collective group, like a military junta. The figurehead might be charismatic, but the power structure is often institutional beneath them.
Okay, so what does this mean for the global political landscape today? Is dictatorship still a major player or is it fading?
Well, the sources suggest there's evidence that dictatorship as the principal alternative to democracy is of declining significance globally. Its major impact in the 20th century was linked to now largely spent ideological forces like fascism and communism. This means it's now mainly a developing world phenomenon, often emerging in states with weak institutions or amidst post-colonial instability. The glaring moral defect, obviously, is its intrinsic link to repression and tyranny. But its major structural defect is its inability to generate or deal with the pressures of social and economic development in the long run.
How so?
It tends to stifle innovation, critical thinking, and the very dynamism needed for sustained societal progress. This often leads to internal instability over time.
That brings us squarely to totalitarianism, which you've already hinted at as the most extreme form of concentrated power. Let's really unpack its unique and, frankly, chilling characteristics.
Totalitarianism is indeed an all-encompassing system of political rule. It's typically established through pervasive ideological manipulation alongside open terror and brutality. And it fundamentally differs from autocracy and authoritarianism precisely because it seeks total power by politicizing every single aspect of social and personal existence.
Every single aspect.
Every single one. This implies the outright abolition of civil society, literally, the abolition of the private sphere. There's nothing outside the state's purview. Every thought, every association, every belief is expected to align with the state's ideology.
That's a truly chilling concept. No private sphere, no personal life separate from the state. Our sources provide a very specific 6-point syndrome to define this level of control. Can you lay those out for us?
Yes, the political scientists Carl Friedrich and Zbigniew Brzezinski, back in 1966, famously defined totalitarianism by these 6 interrelated traits. 1, an official ideology that guides and dictates all aspects of public and private life.
And the rule book for everything.
Essentially. 2, a single one-party state, usually led by an all-powerful leader. 3, a system of terroristic policing that maintains control through fear, surveillance, and repression.
Secret police, yeah.
4, a monopoly of the means of mass communication to control all information and propaganda. 5, a monopoly of the means of armed combat, ensuring no rival power centers exist. And 6, state control of all aspects of economic life, leaving no independent economic sphere.
Wow. That really paints a picture of total, absolute control.
It does. It's a comprehensive syndrome.
What's fascinating here is how this extreme phenomenon is so specifically linked to the 20th century. What allowed it to emerge then? Why not earlier?
Yeah, the rise of totalitarianism is usually believed to be a 20th century phenomenon, precisely because pervasive ideological manipulation and systematic terror require the resources of a modern industrialized state. You need advanced communication technologies, bureaucracy, surveillance capability.
Things that didn't exist before.
Exactly, to implement and maintain control on such a vast scale. The idea itself originated in fascist Italy, where Mussolini articulated this belief in the state as an all-consuming ethical community. It was captured by his doctrine. Everything for the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state.
Yeah.
Then the term was adopted more broadly to describe the uniquely oppressive character of Hitler's Germany and Stalin's USSR. It gained real prominence during the Cold War, used to highlight parallels between fascism and communism, and to frame the global struggle as one between democratic and totalitarian states. It served a clear ideological purpose then.
But the concept itself, despite its utility, has its drawbacks, right? It's not without its critics as an analytical tool.
Indeed. First, as I mentioned, it became deeply intertwined with Cold War ideology. It was sometimes used as a crude form of anti-communist propaganda, potentially oversimplifying complex realities and becoming less an analytical tool and more a political weapon.
Right, blurring important distinctions.
Exactly. Second, it tended to obscure important differences between fascism and communism, particularly regarding their ideological orientation and tolerance for capitalism. Fascism, for instance, often maintained private ownership, unlike communism's goal of state ownership. Third, the idea of total state power is arguably misleading. Some form of resistance or opposition always persists, even in the most brutal and technologically advanced states. People find ways.
Human spirit, perhaps?
Perhaps. Nevertheless, even if the precision of that six-point syndrome is debatable, the concept remains useful. It highlights critical distinctions between modern and traditional dictatorships and draws attention to the power of charismatic leadership. This also gave rise to the idea of totalitarian democracy, where a leader justifies unchecked power by claiming a monopoly of ideological wisdom and articulating the true interests of their people. It creates this facade of popular legitimacy that can be incredibly powerful and deceptive.
And you mentioned Marcuse earlier.
Yes, and here's that really provocative thought from Herbert Marcuse. Back in 1964, he identified totalitarian tendencies even in advanced industrial societies, like the West.
Oh.
He viewed them as one-dimensional societies, where rising affluence helped subdue argument, debate, and absorb all forms of opposition, not through brute force, but through comfortable conformity.
So consumerism as a form of control.
In a way, yes. This raises a really important question for us today. Can prosperity itself inadvertently lead to a different kind of total control, where dissent isn't violently repressed, but simply diffused and absorbed by consumerism, entertainment, and a comfortable lack of critical engagement?
That's a challenging thought. Okay, from that focus on concentrated power, let's pivot sharply. Let's talk about systems designed to distribute it. Our sources provide a deep dive into liberal democracy, which is so often championed, sometimes controversially, as the final form of human government. What are its core features that make it distinct?
Right, liberal democracy. It's the form of democratic rule that brilliantly tries to balance two fundamental principles: limited government on one hand against the ideal of popular consent on the other.
Limited government and popular consent.
Okay. Its liberal features are seen in the internal and external checks placed on government power. These are designed specifically to guarantee liberty and protect citizens from the state's potential overreach. Its democratic character, meanwhile, is built on regular, competitive elections based on universal suffrage and political equality. So it's truly a particular type of regime with the specific intertwined features, not just a generic notion of rule by the people.
So it's not just democracy, it's a specific kind with a particular ethos. What are those core features that really define it, distinguishing it from other forms of rule?
Our sources outline several core features that truly define liberal democracy. First, constitutional government, meaning rule based on formal, usually legal, rules that limit power and define roles. Predictability.
Rule of law.
Exactly. Second, guaranteed civil liberties and individual rights, like freedom of speech, assembly, religion, ensuring personal freedoms are protected. Third, institutional fragmentation and checks and balances. This deliberately disperses power within the government among different branches, legislative, executive, judicial, preventing anyone from becoming too dominant.
Separation of powers, essentially.
Fourth, regular elections, respecting universal suffrage and the principle of one person, one vote, ensuring broad participation and accountability. Fifth, political pluralism. That means real choice in elections and competition between different political parties, allowing diverse viewpoints and policy options to be represented.
Okay.
Sixth, a healthy civil society. That's where organized groups, unions, charities, associations enjoy independence from government. They provide a vital check on state power and a voice for various interests. And finally, almost invariably, a capitalist or private enterprise economy organized along market lines. There's a strong link often made between economic freedom and political freedom in this model.
It's certainly described as the dominant political force globally. Our sources even mention end-of-history theorists like Francis Fukuyama, who famously argued its triumph after the Cold War. What makes it so remarkably successful and seemingly enduring, despite challenges?
Well, its remarkable success seems to stem from two chief factors, according to the analysis. First, liberal democratic systems are generally highly responsive.
Responsive? How?
They establish numerous channels of communication between the government and the governed. Elections, lobbying, media, protests. They allow public input, feedback, and a degree of popular influence on policy. Second, because it almost invariably goes hand in hand with capitalism, it's associated with widespread consumer prosperity, providing tangible material benefits to many of its citizens.
So freedom and stuff.
Crude way to put it, but yes. Theorists argue it's the only political system capable of reliably delivering both political freedom and economic opportunity, and that its processes are robust enough to articulate the concerns of all significant sections of society. Pluralist theorists, who we'll discuss later, particularly praise its capacity for wide power distribution among competing groups. They see this internal competition as a strength that ultimately serves the greater good.
Yet, despite that impressive track record and global dominance, liberal democracy doesn't command universal approval. Who are its main critics, and what are the most powerful arguments they level against it?
No, it definitely faces criticism. Its principal critics are diverse. You have elitists, Marxists, radical Democrats, and feminists, each with distinct and often quite cutting arguments.
Okay, let's break those down. Elitists.
Elitists point out that electoral democracy merely replaces one elite with another. It doesn't challenge the fundamental fact of elite rule. They suggest political equality is largely a sham, as power always resides with a minority, whether elected or not.
Okay, Marxists.
Marxists focus on what they see as the inherent contradiction between political democracy and capitalism. They argue that political egalitarianism masks unequal class power. The dominant economic class effectively rules democratic governments through their control of wealth and other resources, making political freedom illusory without economic equality.
Makes sense from their perspective. Radical Democrats.
Radical Democrats object to its limited and often non-participatory nature. They see voting every few years as a pretty poor manifestation of popular rule and insufficient for genuine accountability. They call for much more direct and continuous citizen participation in decision-making.
And feminists.
Feminists highlight its patriarchal character. They argue it applies democratic principles mainly to traditionally male realms like government and the state, while ignoring the deep-seated male power structures in family and domestic life, which they see as equally political and fundamentally undemocratic.
Wow, those are fundamental critiques.
They are. And while liberal democracy is widely adopted, the persistence of such fundamental critiques from such diverse perspectives really makes you question, can any system truly be finished or perfect if these profound challenges continue to resonate and inspire debate?
A very good question. Now, when we talk about democratic systems, there are different fundamental mechanisms for how power is structured. Let's delve into parliamentary government. How does it primarily work, and what makes it distinct?
Right. A parliamentary system is one where the government governs in and through the parliament or assembly. It effectively fuses the legislative and executive branches.
Fusion, not separation.
Exactly. This distinctly violates the classical doctrine of the separation of powers, setting it apart from presidential government, where those branches are kept separate. In a parliamentary system, the executive's legitimacy and continuation in office are directly tied to the confidence of the legislature.
So that fusion of power is a key differentiator. What are the principal identifying features of a parliamentary system that flow from that?
Okay, its chief features are: first, governments are formed directly from parliamentary elections based on party strength. There's no separately elected executive like a president.
The election winner forms the government.
Generally, yes, or a coalition does. Second, government personnel ministers, the prime minister, are drawn from the parliament, usually from the ranks of the majority party leaders. They sit in parliament. Third, the government is directly responsible to the parliament. It rests on its confidence and can be removed by it, generally by the lower chamber, through votes of no confidence.
So parliament can fire the government.
In theory, yes. Fourth, the government can often dissolve parliament by calling an election, making terms flexible within a maximum limit. This gives the government leverage against the legislature. Fifth, executives are generally collective, accepting at least the formal principle of cabinet government, where decisions are supposed to be made jointly. And finally, the head of government, usually a prime minister, is separate from the head of state, who is either a constitutional monarch or a non-executive president.
Our sources mention the Westminster model. Is that the standard for all parliamentary systems, or are there variations? Does everyone copy the UK?
Well, while many liberal democracies adopt some form of parliamentary government and are often informally seen as Westminster model systems because of the UK's historical influence,
Right.
the full Westminster model includes specific features, things like a strong two-party system, the principle of parliamentary sovereignty, where Parliament is the supreme legal authority, and strict collective responsibility within the cabinet. These specific features may be absent in other parliamentary systems, like those in Germany, Sweden, India, Japan, New Zealand, Australia. They adapt the parliamentary structure to their unique political cultures and party systems. So there's a broad family resemblance, but significant variations definitely exist.
Okay, so it's not one size fits all. What's considered the main strength of the system, particularly in delivering effective governance? Why choose it?
Its chief strength is often seen as its ability to deliver strong but responsible government.
Strong but responsible.
It's considered strong because, since it rests on Parliament's confidence, a government with a clear parliamentary majority can usually ensure its legislative program passes relatively easily. It allows governments to get things done, pursue a coherent policy agenda. It's responsible because the government governs only as long as it retains that confidence. Parliament theoretically has the upper hand because it has the power to remove the government, a power not found in presidential systems. Plus, parliamentary government is often seen to promote democracy because Parliament itself plays a vital deliberative role as a forum for national debate, acting as a popular check upon government actions.
That ideal sounds very effective. But as always, there are criticisms too, especially about executive domination. How does that tension play out in reality?
Yes, the actual workings of parliamentary government depend heavily on the nature of the party system and the political culture. It can absolutely become a form of party government.
Party government.
Yeah, if a single cohesive party holds a majority and operates with a strong mandate from the electorate. In such cases, Parliament can sometimes be reduced to little more than a talking shop, where individual members become lobby fodder, just voting along party lines as instructed. This is what Lord Hailsham famously termed elective dictatorship in the UK case. It highlights a concern about potentially unchecked executive power, despite democratic elections.
So the government controls Parliament, not the other way around.
In practice, often yes. Conversely, if the party system is fractured, which is often associated with highly proportional electoral systems.
Your lots of small parties get seats.
Right. Then it can lead to weak government and political instability. Coalitions might be fragile and collapse frequently. The French Fourth Republic, for instance, saw 25 governments in just over 12 years. Italy had something like 52 governments between 1945 and 1996.
Wow, that's unstable.
Exactly. So ironically, parliamentary government can result in either excessive executive power through strong party control, or excessive legislative power due to fractured coalitions leading to chronic instability and deadlock. This raises a really important question for any society considering this model. What's the optimal balance? How do you ensure both effectiveness and long-term stability?
A tricky balance indeed. The other major alternative in liberal democracies is, of course, presidential government. How does it fundamentally differ from the parliamentary systems we just discussed?
Presidential government is fundamentally characterized by a constitutional and political separation of powers between the legislative and executive branches.
Separation is key.
Separation is the key word. Executive power is vested in an independently elected president who is not directly accountable to or removable by the assembly or parliament, except through the exceptional, often very difficult process of impeachment. This is a fundamental structural difference.
Yeah.
Distinct electoral mandates for each branch, rather than the fusion seen in parliamentary systems.
And what are its principal features that flow directly from that separation of powers?
Okay, the principal features are: the executive and legislature are separately elected. Each has independent constitutional powers. There's a formal separation of personnel between the branches, so ministers are typically not also members of the legislature, unlike in parliamentary systems.
Different people in different branches.
Right. The executive is not constitutionally responsible to the legislature and cannot normally be removed by it, barring impeachment. The president cannot dissolve the legislature, meaning fixed terms for both branches. This provides stability, but also potential rigidity.
Stuck with each other.
Pretty much. Executive authority is concentrated in the president. The cabinet and ministers are merely advisors, ultimately responsible to the president alone. And finally, the president combines the roles of head of state and head of government, effectively wearing two hats simultaneously, embodying both national unity and executive leadership.
The USA is, of course, the classic example of a presidential system. What are its strengths considered to be, particularly as originally conceived by the founders?
Well, the principal strength, particularly as intended by the U.S. Constitution's founding fathers, is that by separating legislative and executive power, it deliberately creates internal tensions. These tensions are designed to help protect individual rights and liberties, serving as a bulwark against executive domination.
Checks and balances.
Precisely. For instance, in the USA, Congress has the power to declare war and raise taxes. The Senate can ratify treaties and confirm presidential appointments. These are significant checks on presidential power. Also, the president, as the single nationally elected politician, can serve as a strong focus for patriotic loyalty and national unity, embodying the nation in a way a prime minister perhaps can't. And the dispersal of power also allows government, arguably, to be more democratic by being responsive to competing minorities, as various interests can find access points and influence in different branches.
However, it sounds like that very separation, that invitation to struggle, as you put it, could also lead to significant problems. What are the main criticisms?
It can indeed. Presidential systems can be ineffective and cumbersome precisely because of that separation. It can often create what's been called an invitation to struggle between the executive and legislative branches.
Gridlock.
Gridlock is the common term, yes.
Yeah.
Critics of the U.S. system, for example, argue that since the president proposes and Congress disposes, it's often a recipe for institutional deadlock or government gridlock. This means policy initiatives can be stalled or completely blocked, especially when different parties control the White House and Capitol Hill. Legislative paralysis.
Which happens quite often.
It does. But it can even happen when both branches are controlled by the same party, as seen during the Carter administration. Inherent structural tensions and divergent priorities even within the same party can still cause blockages.
And what about semi-presidential systems? We hear about those in places like France. Are they an attempt to get the best of both worlds, or do they have their own issues?
Semi-presidential systems, found in countries like France and Finland, represent exactly that.
Yeah.
An attempt to overcome gridlock and combine the perceived strengths of both systems. They operate with a dual executive, a separately elected president working alongside a prime minister and cabinet who are drawn from and accountable to Parliament.
So a mix.
A mix. In some cases, policy-making responsibilities are divided, with the president often handling foreign affairs and the cabinet handling domestic issues. However, even these hybrid systems have faced similar institutional tensions. They've given rise to situations called cohabitation, when presidents are forced to work with prime ministers from rival parties. This can still lead to periods of intense political friction and policy deadlock.
So no perfect solution.
It highlights the ongoing, perhaps fundamental challenge of designing systems that are both effective in governing and truly democratic in their accountability.
Shifting gears again, thinking about how democracies structure themselves, especially in diverse societies, we have consociationalism. That's a bit of a mouthful. What is this approach aiming to achieve specifically?
Yeah, consociationalism. It's a form of government that starkly contrasts with the majoritarianism winner-take-all of Westminster-style systems. It's particularly suited or designed for the needs of divided or plural societies, those with deep ethnic, religious, or linguistic cleavages.
Where simple majority rule might be dangerous.
Exactly. Where it might lead to the permanent exclusion or oppression of minorities. Consociationalism aims for stability by deliberately accommodating diverse segments rather than letting a simple majority dominate. It prioritizes consensus and inclusion over pure majority rule, seeking to prevent conflict by institutionalizing cooperation between the segments.
Our sources cite Aaron Lidgfart, a key theorist in this area, and his two major features that define this system. Could you explain them?
Yes. Lidgfart identifies two major features. The first is executive power sharing, usually through a grand coalition that represents all significant segments of society. This ensures all major groups have a voice at the highest level of government. In presidential systems, this might involve distributing other high offices among segments.
Everyone gets a seat at the table.
Essentially, yes. The second is that the various segments of society enjoy a large measure of autonomy. This is guaranteed by mechanisms like federalism or devolution, allowing them to govern their own affairs, like education or cultural matters, to a significant degree without central interference. Two more minor features can also be present. Representative mechanisms that ensure proportionality for minority political voice, making sure smaller groups aren't underrepresented in elected bodies. And a minority veto.
A veto.
Yes, a minority veto to prevent the majority will from violating the vital interests of smaller sections. It's a critical safeguard against the tyranny of the majority on core issues for a minority group.
Where has this approach actually been practiced, and what specific conditions seem to favor its success? It sounds like it wouldn't work everywhere.
No, it probably wouldn't. It's been widely practiced, particularly in continental Europe after World War II. Examples include Austria for a period 1945-66, Belgium since 1918, the Netherlands and Luxembourg for a long stretch, 1917-67. Elements have even been seen in modern-day Israel and Canada in certain respects, though perhaps not in their full, pure form. The conditions that particularly favor its success seem to be a relatively small number, ideally 3 to 5 of roughly equal-sized and geographically concentrated segments. This simplifies power sharing.
Makes sense.
Also, a disposition among the segments to seek national consensus based on overarching loyalties, a willingness to compromise and cooperate for the greater good despite differences. The absence of major socioeconomic inequalities that could exacerbate divisions helps too, and a relatively small total population can make managing segment relations and intergroup communication easier.
What are its core strengths in those deeply divided societies where majoritarian rule might genuinely lead to conflict or breakup?
Its core strength is offering an institutional solution that aims to be both stable and democratic in societies prone to conflict. It achieves this by balancing compromise against autonomy. Matters of common national concern are decided jointly by representatives of all key segments, ensuring inclusivity, preventing any single group from feeling totally excluded. At the same time, it allows segments maximum independence on other concerns, respecting their distinct identities and practices. This dual approach aims to prevent civil strife while maintaining democratic principles and a sense of shared nationhood, however fragile.
But of course, it also faces criticisms. What are the main concerns about its effectiveness or broader applicability?
The main criticisms are basically twofold. First, the combination of conditions that favor its success is so complex and specific.
All those things you just listed.
Right. It's often argued consociationalism is appropriate only for very particular societies and maybe only for limited periods. Its applicability might be quite narrow. It might not be a universal solution for all divided societies. Second, consociationalism has been criticized as being potentially inherently unstable. Its very emphasis on power sharing and protecting minority interests can, ironically, create an arena for constant struggle among rival segments, rather than a basis for genuine, deep-seated compromise.
So it could freeze conflict rather than solve it.
It could. It might institutionalize divisions rather than overcome them, potentially leading to persistent negotiation, deadlock, and even an inability to address critical national issues efficiently because everyone has a veto or requires consensus.
Okay, finally in this section on distributing power, let's explore republicanism. It sounds like it simply means not a monarchy, but our sources suggest there's a much richer and more complex tradition here. What's the deeper meaning?
You're exactly right. While it literally refers to a preference for a republic without a monarch over a monarchy, the term republic also implies something more. From its Latin root res publica, meaning common or collective affairs.
The public thing.
The public thing, exactly. It implies a distinctively public arena and popular rule focused on the common good. Republicanism has thus developed into a broader school of political theory, advocating certain moral precepts and institutional structures that extend far beyond just the absence of a king or queen. It's about the very nature of public life and civic engagement.
What's the core moral concern driving republicanism, and how has its institutional focus shifted over time? It sounds like it has a long history.
It does. The moral concern is expressed in a belief in civic virtue.
Civic virtue.
Yeah, things like public spiritedness, honor, patriotism, with a strong stress on active public activity over purely private pursuits. It emphasizes the active engagement of citizens in the common good as essential for a healthy society. Institutionally, classical republicanism, drawing on ancient Greek and Roman thought, was associated with mixed government. The idea was to combine monarchical, aristocratic, and democratic elements to achieve stability through balance.
Like ancient Rome or Sparta?
Exactly. However, the American and French revolutions reshaped it dramatically. They applied it to whole nations, not just small city-states, and endorsed modern democratic government implications. In its U.S. version, it came to mean acceptance of divided government through federalism and the separation of powers to protect liberty. In its French version, it's more closely associated with radical democracy and Rousseau's concept of the general will, emphasizing popular sovereignty and a unified national purpose. So different flavors emerged.
So at its heart, it sounds like it's deeply about active citizenship and participation in public life.
Precisely. Its major defense is its emphasis on civic freedom. This is often presented as a richer concept than simply individual liberty or non-interference.
How so?
It combines liberty protection from arbitrary government interference with the full and active participation of citizens in public and political life. Civic republicanism, which saw a revival particularly from the 1960s onwards, seeks to reestablish the public domain as the principal source of personal fulfillment. It directly rejects the tendency towards privatization, advocated by some modern ideologies like the New Right. It's fundamentally linked to the notion of active citizenship, arguing that true freedom and personal flourishing come through engagement in the collective life of the community, not just through private pursuits.
That's a compelling vision. What are the main criticisms leveled against republicanism, given its broad scope and diverse interpretations?
Well, it's criticized for being politically incoherent sometimes. Because it's associated with such a wide variety of political forms and interpretations across history, it can be difficult to pin down a single, consistent definition.
It means different things to different people.
Somewhat, yes. It's also often seen as potentially illiberal by some critics, because it tends to reject the idea of freedom as purely privacy and non-interference, and because its emphasis on civic virtue and the public good has sometimes been used historically to justify the expansion of government responsibilities. This, critics argue, could potentially encroach on individual liberties in the name of the common good.
So, a potential conflict with individual rights.
That's the concern. It raises an important question. Can a strong focus on the public inadvertently erode essential individual liberties? And if so, what's the right balance between robust civic engagement and protecting private autonomy?
Okay, let's now shift gears. Let's look at some fundamental economic and social systems that heavily influence governance and the very fabric of society. And we really have to start with capitalism. It's a term we hear constantly, but what are its central defining features according to our sources?
Right, capitalism. It's both an economic system and a form of property ownership. Its central features are generally identified as: first, generalized commodity production. This means goods or services are primarily produced for exchange in a market. They have market value rather than just direct use value for the person who made them.
Things are made to be sold.
Primarily, yes. Second, productive wealth, things like factories, land, capital, is predominantly held in private hands rather than by the state or a collective body. Third, economic life is organized largely by impersonal market forces. Specifically, supply and demand, which determine prices, allocate resources, and guide production decisions.
The market decides.
To a large extent. And fourth, material self-interest and profit maximization provide the main motivation for enterprise and hard work. These are seen as the engines driving economic activity and innovation.
So it's fundamentally about markets, private ownership, and profit motive. But our sources are very clear that there's no single pure capitalist system out there in the real world. Can you explain the different types mentioned? Because they sound quite varied.
That's absolutely right. All real-world economic systems are shaped by historical, cultural, and ideological contexts. They're often contaminated, you might say, by other influences, meaning they're rarely textbook pure. Our sources identify at least three broad types of capitalism.
Okay, what's the first?
First, enterprise capitalism, often called free market capitalism. Think the USA, and since the 1980s, increasingly the UK. This is characterized by a strong faith in, well, untrammeled market competition, minimal public ownership, safety net welfare provision rather than comprehensive, and relatively weak trade unions. It embodies a more laissez-faire approach.
Okay, second type.
Second, social capitalism, sometimes called Rhine-Alpine capitalism. This is found throughout continental Europe, especially Germany. It's characterized by a social market idea. It tries to balance market disciplines against social cohesion and solidarity. This balance is guaranteed by significant economic and social intervention and often a robust welfare state. It seeks a more managed approach, balancing market efficiency with social well-being.
And the third?
Third, collective capitalism, or sometimes tiger capitalism. Typical of East Asia generally, and increasingly prominent in China, although China is complex. This is characterized by what the sources call relational markets, meaning close connections between industry and finance and between producers and government. There's a strong emphasis on collaborative effort and national development, sometimes called peopleism, which prioritizes collective national progress, perhaps over purely individualistic gain.
What's fascinating here is how capitalism emerged from earlier economic forms and then became such a globally dominant system. Can you give us that historical trajectory briefly?
Sure. Capitalist economic forms first emerged gradually in 17th and 18th century Europe. They evolved out of predominantly feudal societies through things like market-oriented agriculture and the rise of wage labor, which broke down traditional bonds. Developed industrial capitalism then emerged in the mid-19th century, first in the UK and then spreading rapidly. This was characterized by machine-based factory production and massive population shifts to cities.
The Industrial Revolution.
Exactly. Then, having famously defied socialist predictions of its imminent demise, and having successfully withstood the intense 20th century ideological battle against communism.
The Cold War.
Right. Capitalism emerged as a truly global system without serious rivals after the Eastern European revolutions of 1989-91. Its dual secrets of success, according to the analysis, are its incredible flexibility, its ability to absorb non-capitalist impurities and adapt to vastly different cultures, and its seemingly relentless capacity to generate technological development and innovation. This, in turn, has delivered widespread, although admittedly very uneven, prosperity globally.
It's clearly a polarizing topic, and for good reason. Our sources identify three very broad stances on capitalism, reflecting that fundamental left-right ideological divide. Can you outline those for us?
Indeed. The left-right ideological divide is often interpreted, at its core, as a battle between anti-capitalist and pro-capitalist positions. The first stance, taken by fundamentalist socialists like Karl Marx, completely rejects capitalism. They see it as an inherently unjust system of mass exploitation. They argue it's doomed due to a fundamental, irreconcilable contradiction between oppressors, the bourgeoisie, the capital owners, and the oppressed, the proletariat, the workers.
So inevitable collapse.
That was the prediction.
Yeah.
The second stance is adopted by parliamentary socialists, modern liberals, and also paternalist conservatives. It's summed up rather well by the economist J.M. Keynes, who famously viewed capitalism as a good servant but a bad master.
Good servant, bad master.
Meaning they accept it's a reliable wealth generator, probably the best we've found. But they emphasize that unregulated capitalism is chronically unstable, prone to high unemployment, severe economic crises, and wide material inequalities. The issue from this perspective isn't capitalism itself, but how and to what extent it should be reformed or humanized through robust regulation, social welfare programs, redistribution, and state management.
Taming the beast, essentially.
You could put it that way. The third stance is adopted by classical liberals, the New Right, and anarcho-capitalists. They believe capitalism is largely a self-regulating mechanism and should be encumbered as little as possible by external controls. This is the principle of laissez-faire, literally leave to do.
Hands off.
Hands off. Adam Smith, with his famous invisible hand theory, was its earliest and most influential exponent. He argued that the market, left alone, tends towards long-run equilibrium and an optimal allocation of resources through individual self-interest. This perspective leads to a fundamental question for us today. How much intervention is too much or too little to achieve both economic efficiency and social well-being within a capitalist system? Where do you draw the line?
That's the perennial debate, isn't it? That brings us directly to a system that represents, in many ways, the polar opposite of capitalism, collectivization. What defines this system?
Collectivization is a system in which property is owned and controlled by a collective body, usually through the mechanism of the state.
State ownership.
Essentially, yes. It's a comprehensive form of nationalization, bringing the entirety of economic life, not just selected key industries, but everything under state control. Crucially, collectivized economies are organized by planning, rather than the spontaneous forces of the market. The state attempts to allocate resources rationally based on defined goals, aiming for perhaps a more equitable distribution or strategic industrial development, like building heavy industry quickly.
The USSR is cited as the prime example of collectivization. How did it work there in practice, and what was its original appeal? Why did they try it?
Right. Under Joseph Stalin, collectivization was introduced quite brutally in the USSR through a series of ambitious five-year plans, starting in 1928. All Soviet enterprises, factories, farms, shops were set detailed planning targets by Gosplan, the state planning committee. And they were administered by powerful economic ministries. It was a massive bureaucratic undertaking.
Top-down control.
Completely top-down. The original appeal was its promise to achieve key socialist goals, gearing the entire economy to wider societal needs rather than private profit, and abolishing or at least substantially reducing material inequalities, aiming for a more egalitarian society where wealth was shared according to need, not market forces.
So a grand vision, but ultimately what happened to it? It didn't endure globally, did it?
No, it didn't. That's right. Collectivization effectively collapsed with the Eastern European revolutions of 1989-91, which dismantled the Soviet bloc. And where communism did survive, like in China and Cuba, it did so in large part by abandoning comprehensive collectivization and introducing significant market-oriented reforms, acknowledging its inherent flaws.
What were those flaws? Why did it fail?
Major criticisms include its inherent inefficiency. Because it's not profit-oriented and allows very little scope for material incentives, it often leads to stagnation, lack of innovation, waste, and frequently chronic shortages of basic goods.
The cues.
Exactly. Furthermore, it's seen by many critics as implicitly totalitarian, because such comprehensive state control of the economy represents a fundamental threat to civil society and individual autonomy. The argument is that the absence of economic freedom inevitably threatens political freedom, as individuals become entirely dependent on the state for their livelihoods and have no independent economic base from which to resist or dissent.
A worrying link.
It raises a crucial question about the, perhaps inseparable, relationship between economic and political liberty.
Our sources also introduce corporatism, which seems to be a fascinating blend of state and interest groups. Rather than a clear opposite of one system or another, what exactly is it?
Right, corporatism. In its broader sense, it's a means of incorporating organized interests into the processes of government.
Organized interests, like unions and businesses.
Exactly. It recognizes the political significance of functional or socioeconomic divisions in society like labor, business, agriculture, professional groups, and believe these divisions can be reconciled through institutions aiming for a higher national interest. It seeks a form of social harmony and collaboration rather than open conflict between these groups.
And our sources highlight that there are two quite distinct faces to corporatism, authoritarian and liberal. How do those differ? They sound like opposites.
Yes, they're very different in practice, despite the shared name. Authoritarian corporatism, often called state corporatism, is closely associated with Italian fascism under Mussolini. It aimed to establish his corporate state. While it claimed to embody organic unity and national purpose, it operated primarily through political intimidation of industry and the destruction of independent trade unions. It was essentially a top-down mechanism for rigid state control over the economy and society, suppressing independent groups.
Okay, so top-down control. What about liberal corporatism?
In contrast, liberal corporatism, sometimes called neo-corporatism, refers to a tendency found in mature liberal democracies. Here, organized interests like peak associations for business and labor gain privileged, institutionalized access to policy formulation.
So they get a seat at the table, officially.
Yes, often formally. This is often seen as a bottom-up form, potentially strengthening these groups relative to the government by giving them a direct, formal voice in policy decisions, often in tripartite bodies with government.
So where did this idea of corporatism come from originally, and how significant was liberal corporatism in particular historically?
Well, the original idea, as I mentioned, emerged from Mussolini's Italy. It was linked to a fascist interpretation of Catholic social theory that emphasized groups over individuals and social harmony through a unified national body. However, fascist corporatism primarily served as a tool for state control over the economy, and attempts to export this model largely failed economically. It wasn't very effective. Liberal corporatism, on the other hand, was much more politically significant, especially in the early post-World War II period. Think economic reconstruction, building the welfare state, seeking social consensus.
The post-war consensus period.
Exactly. Some see it as state-specific, particularly influential in countries like Austria, Sweden, the Netherlands, Germany, Japan, places where governments practiced active economic management through extensive consultation with key social partners. Others view it as a more general phenomenon, implicit in modern economic and social development. Reflecting a kind of symbiotic relationship between organized groups and government, groups seek insider status for policy access and influence, right? And government needs these groups for their knowledge, their expertise, and crucially, to help ensure compliance with policies once they're agreed. This can facilitate social stability and economic development.
But it sounds like the drift towards corporatism has been reversed since the 1970s or 80s, with growing criticism. What were the main concerns that led to that reversal?
Yes, enthusiasm waned significantly. Critics have many concerns. First, it tends to narrow representation. It often leads to a tripartism that binds government, big business, and big unions, but frequently excludes other important groups, consumer groups, environmental groups, smaller businesses, non-unionized workers. Access is restricted to only a few powerful peak associations.
Leaves people out.
It can, yes. Second, the distinction between liberal and authoritarian corporatism can sometimes seem more apparent than real, because privileged access often comes with an expectation that group leaders must deliver their members' compliance with agreements made behind closed doors. This can feel like control from the top down, even if it starts with consultation. Third, it can weaken formal democratic representation. Important decisions might be made outside Parliament or public view through bargaining processes not subject to political scrutiny or public oversight. This undermines transparency and accountability. And finally, new right theorists, especially influential from the 80s onwards, argued it causes government overload. The idea is that government gets captured, by the powerful groups it consults, becoming unable to resist their demands. This fuels interventionism, spirals spending, and stifles competition and market vigor.
Lots of criticisms.
Quite a few. It leads to a crucial question. Can such concentrated group influence ever truly be balanced with broader democratic accountability and the public good? Or does it inevitably lead to special interests dominating or undermining public oversight?
Building on that idea of distributed power and diverse voices, let's look at pluralism. This concept seems to be all about diversity and multiplicity, almost the opposite of corporatism's focus on peak groups. How do our sources define it?
Indeed. Pluralism, broadly speaking, means a belief in or a commitment to diversity or multiplicity. The existence of many things, many different groups, values, or ideas. It can be normative, arguing that diversity is healthy and desirable, that it safeguards freedom and promotes debate. Or it can simply be descriptive, observing various forms of diversity that exist in society.
Like what kinds of diversity?
Well, political pluralism, meaning electoral choice in competitive parties. Moral pluralism, acknowledging a multiplicity of ethical values and beliefs. Or cultural pluralism, recognizing a diversity of lifestyles, traditions, and subcultures within a single society.
More narrowly, though, it's also a specific theory about political power distribution, isn't it? Challenging the idea that power is concentrated.
Yes, exactly. As a political theory, classical pluralism holds that power is widely and evenly dispersed in society. It argues power is not concentrated in a single elite or ruling class. It's often seen as a theory of group politics. It argues that individuals are primarily represented through various organized groups, and crucially, that all such groups have meaningful access to the policy process. It suggests a dynamic interplay of competing interests within the political system, preventing anyone from dominating.
What are its core assumptions about how society and power operate to make that happen?
Okay, the main assumptions of classical pluralism are generally these. First, that all citizens belong to groups, often with multiple overlapping memberships. This means no single individual is tied to a single, unchangeable interest. Loyalties are divided.
Cross-cutting cleavages.
Precisely. Second, there's rough equality among groups. They have relatively equal access to government, and no single group holds a dominant position, ensuring fair competition. Third, there's high internal responsiveness within groups. Leaders are accountable to their members, ensuring true representation of interests. Fourth, the state is largely neutral among these competing groups. It acts as an umpire or referee. And the fragmented nature of the governmental machine offers multiple access points for different interests to exert influence.
Different doors to knock on.
Exactly. And finally, there's a wider consensus among groups on the political system itself, the rules of the game, and core values like openness and competition. This provides a stable framework for resolving disputes peacefully.
Our sources also mention reformed pluralism or neo-pluralism. How did the theory adapt when faced with criticisms that maybe power isn't quite so evenly dispersed?
Right. This revised version of classical pluralism acknowledges that power distribution in modern societies is, well, imperfect in reality. It accepts that elite and privileged interests do persist, even within the context of broader group competition. Western democracies are thus viewed by neo-pluralists as deformed polyarchies.
Deformed polyarchies.
Yeah, meaning systems with many centers of power, polyarchy, but deformed because some players, particularly major corporations, exert disproportionate influence due to their immense economic power, lobbying capacity, and privileged access. It's a more realistic, less idealized version of the theory, accepting that not all groups are truly equal on the playing field.
How is pluralism historically linked to democracy, particularly liberal democracy? It sounds like a foundational concept.
It really is. Pluralist ideas trace back to early liberal thinkers like John Locke and Montesquieu. They were systematically developed by James Madison in the Federalist Papers.
Ah, Madison. Factions.
Exactly. He advocated divided government separation of powers, bicameralism, federalism, precisely to resist the tyranny of the majority and give minorities a voice, aiming for a stable republic by balancing competing interests or factions. Modern pluralist theorists like Robert Dahl strongly emphasized its link to liberal democracy. They saw political pluralism, multiple parties, competing groups, as a key feature allowing electors independent views and providing a mechanism to remove unpopular governments through electoral competition. They often argued that democracy operates less through formal elections alone and more through the constant interplay between government and organized groups, seeing group activity as an essential alternative channel for representation, complementing parliamentary or majoritarian democracy. And in some ways, postmodernism, with its rejection of monolithic societal theories, has revived pluralist ideas by emphasizing multiplicity, diversity, and discourse over grand unifying narratives.
But pluralism, even in its reformed version, has certainly been attacked from various perspectives. Who are its main critics, and what are their core arguments against it?
Yes, it's faced strong attacks from elitists, Marxists, and the New Right, each from their own distinct angle. Elitists, as we touched on earlier, point out that many interests like the unemployed, the homeless, maybe even consumers as a general group, lack a meaningful political voice simply because they're unorganized or lack resources. They also argue that powerful business groups controlling employment and investment are invariably dominant, making the whole even dispersion of power a myth.
Power isn't equal.
Right. Marxists highlight the structural inequalities they see stemming from capitalism's ownership system. They argue the state is inherently biased towards business interests, serving the dominant economic class, making the idea of a neutral state referee simply untenable. And the New Right criticizes what they call pluralistic stagnation. The idea is that the excessive growth of rival group pressures leads to overload on government. This results in spiraling public spending, excessive state intervention, and ultimately stifles competition and market vigor, leading to economic decline. Neo-pluralism, as we mentioned, largely emerged as a direct response trying to address these powerful criticisms.
Okay. And you mentioned earlier the surprising point about pluralism.
Yes, and here's that truly surprising point from the sources. While political pluralism is widely approved, generally seen as healthy for democracy, moral and cultural pluralism are not universally accepted.
How so?
Well, liberals tend to see diversity in moral and cultural life as an essential expression of toleration and individual freedom. Live and let live. But traditional conservatives and religious fundamentalists often argue it actually weakens society's foundations, which they believe rely on shared values and a common moral purpose. They worry it fosters moral relativism, undermines social cohesion, and fails to provide clear ethical guidance, potentially leading to social fragmentation or decay.
A deep tension there.
Absolutely. It raises a profound question for any society navigating these issues. Can a society truly embrace diversity in all its forms, in all spheres of life, without risking its own cohesion and shared sense of purpose? Is there a limit?
That's a profound thought that really makes you consider the deeper implications of diversity. Okay, now, let's explore elitism. This concept seems to directly contradict pluralism, arguing that power is always concentrated, not dispersed. What do we mean by elite in this context?
Indeed, it's pretty much the direct counter-argument to pluralism. The term elite can mean the highest or best, implying some kind of superiority, but in a more neutral sense used in political science, it simply refers to a minority in whose hands power, wealth, or privilege is concentrated. Whether that concentration is justifiable or not is a separate question. Elitism, then, is the belief in or the practice of rule by such minority. It asserts that this concentration of power is a fundamental reality of social life.
And our sources break down different forms of elitism. What are those, and how have they evolved over time? It's not just one single idea.
No, there are at least three distinct forms identified. First, normative elitism. This is a political theory suggesting that elite rule is actually desirable, usually because power should be vested in a wise or enlightened minority, think Plato's philosopher kings. This implicitly argues that democracy, or rule by the masses, is inherently flawed or undesirable.
Rule by a best.
Theoretically, yes. Second, classical elitism. This claimed to be empirical, not normative. It asserted that elite rule is inevitable, an unchangeable fact of social existence.
Just the way things are.
Exactly. This implies that egalitarian ideas are fundamentally impossible to achieve in practice. Key figures here include Vilfredo Pareto, who theorized about elites of foxes, ruling by cunning, versus lions, ruling by coercion. Gaetano Mosca focused on how unequally distributed resources inevitably lead to elite power, and Robert Michaels developed his famous iron law of oligarchy, arguing that all organizations, even those founded on democratic principles, inevitably tend towards rule by a small, self-serving group at the top.
The iron law sounds grim.
It's a pessimistic view, certainly. Third, modern elitism. This also uses empirical analysis, but is generally more critical about the causes of elite rule. It links them to specific economic and political structures, rather than just declaring it inevitable. This form often highlights elite rule in hopes of challenging it. See, Wright Mills' work on the power elite in America is a prime example. He wasn't saying it would, he was pointing it out as a problem.
And then there's Democratic elitism, that sounds almost like a contradiction in terms. How does that fit into this picture?
Yeah, it does sound contradictory. That's a key development within modern elitism, often called pluralist or competitive elitism. It acknowledges that modern elites are typically fractured rather than unified. There isn't just one single elite. And crucially, rivalry among these different elites can, to some extent, ensure non-elite groups get a political voice by playing one elite faction against another.
So competition between elites helps democracy.
In a limited way, that's the argument. Joseph Schumpeter's realistic model of democracy, for example, emphasized that while elections decide which elite gets to rule for a time, they don't change the fundamental fact that power is always exercised by an elite. This perspective gave rise to the economic theory of democracy, which treats electoral competition like a political market where elites compete for votes as consumers, voters, choose between them. It's a more nuanced view, trying to reconcile the reality of elite power with the processes of democracy.
What's the significance of elitism today? How does it help us understand contemporary power structures? Does it still hold water?
Well, normative elitism, the idea that elite rule is good, is largely abandoned today due to the widespread global embrace of democratic ideals. Nobody openly advocates for philosopher kings anymore.
Not publicly, anyway.
Right. However, representative democracy itself still embodies some residual elitist assumptions. Decisions are made by professional politicians, bureaucrats, experts, not directly by the public. There's an implicit trust in an elected elite. Classical elitism significantly impacted social and political theory. It was often used to reject Marxist ideas of a classal society. But it's criticized for overgeneralizing from assumptions and being hard to reconcile with modern, more participatory forms of democracy. Modern elitism, however, still offers an important critical lens for understanding both pluralism and democracy. Mill's power elite model, for instance, while departing from strict Marxism, drew significant attention to the disproportionate influence of the military-industrial complex in the USA. It demonstrates how power can concentrate even within a seemingly open democratic system.
But it has limitations.
Yes. Despite its influence, particularly in analyses of the USA, elitism has drawbacks. It's arguably less theoretically sophisticated than, say, Marxism or pluralism, and the empirical evidence needed to definitively sustain its conclusions, especially about national power distribution, is often unconvincing or very difficult to gather and prove conclusively. This raises an important question. Even if we accept that power isn't perfectly distributed, does elite theory adequately explain why and how power is concentrated? Or does it sometimes just state the observation without fully unpacking the underlying mechanisms and causes?
A good point. Finally, in this section on social constructs, let's discuss patriarchy. This term gains significant prominence, especially with second-wave feminism. What does it fundamentally mean?
Right, patriarchy. Literally, it means rule by the father, from pater in Latin. Originally referring to the domination of the husband and father within the family unit and the subordination of his wives and children.
The head of the household.
Exactly. However, the term is most commonly used today in a much more general sense. Rule by men. It draws attention to the totality of oppression and exploitation to which women are subject across society, not just within the family. The use of the term implies that the system of male power in society at large both reflects and stems from the domination of the father in the family. This is famously encapsulated in the radical feminist slogan, "The personal is the political."
Meaning power dynamics in private life are inherently political issues.
Precisely. Kate Millett, in her hugely influential 1970 work Sexual Politics, argued that patriarchy contains two core principles. Male shall dominate female, elder male shall dominate younger male. This suggests a patriarchal society is characterized by interlocking systems of both sexual and generational oppression.
That personal is political idea really reframes a lot of traditional thought, doesn't it? How is patriarchy interpreted differently by various feminist schools? It doesn't seem like they all use it in exactly the same way.
No, they don't. Its immense value, broadly, is that it draws attention to the political significance of gender itself and the fundamental political relationship between women and men. While conventional political theory often treats gender relations as natural, biological, or simply apolitical, feminists, using the concept of patriarchy, view them as part of the political institution of male power. It's a system, not just nature.
Okay, so how do different strands of feminism view it?
Well, for radical feminists, patriarchy is a key, perhaps the key overarching concept. They emphasize that gender inequality is systematic, institutionalized, and pervasive across all social institutions and societies. They often believe gender divisions are deeper and more politically significant than other divisions based on nationality, social class, race, or ethnicity.
Patriarchy is the primary oppression.
Often, yes. Socialist feminists, in contrast, highlight the crucial links between gender inequality and social class inequality. They see patriarchy and capitalism as interdependent systems of domination, where capitalism reinforces male power and vice versa. They need to be tackled together. Liberal feminists are sometimes more reluctant to use the term patriarchy, at least in its most radical sense. They are less likely to prioritize gender divisions over other forms of inequality. They tend to understand gender inequality more in terms of unequal rights, opportunities, and entitlements, rather than a system of pervasive, systematic oppression. They often believe that reform within existing liberal democratic systems can address these inequalities.
More focus on legal and political equality.
Generally, yes. And then you have post-feminist theorists. They argue that significant advances for women, at least in developed Western societies, mean patriarchy is no longer a useful or appropriate term. They contend that patriarchal institutions and practices have been substantially reformed, if not dismantled entirely, and that continuing to focus on patriarchy might obscure the progress that has been made or even disempower women.
So the debate continues.
Absolutely. And it raises a really important question for us. How do we assess the continued relevance of a concept like patriarchy when its historical manifestations appear to have changed significantly, at least in some parts of the world? Does acknowledging progress mean the underlying system itself has been dismantled, or has it just evolved into subtler forms?
A very pertinent question. #TAG dynamic forces in political systems. Okay, let's move on now to powerful forces that can fundamentally change or shape these systems we've been discussing. And first up, one of the most dramatic concepts, revolution. What's the modern understanding of this term? Because its meaning has shifted over time, hasn't it?
That's right, it has. The term revolution originally meant cyclical change, a return to a previous state. Like the Glorious Revolution of 1688 in England, that was seen by its proponents as a restoration of a proper political order, not a radical break with the past.
Turning back the clock, almost.
In a sense, yes. However, the French Revolution of 1789 truly established the modern concept we use today, a process of dramatic and far-reaching change, involving the destruction and replacement of an old order with something entirely new. It signifies a decisive and often violent break from the past.
So it's about fundamental change, a total upheaval. But are there different types of revolutions beyond just a political overthrow? Is it always about storming the palace?
No, not always. Our sources clearly distinguish between different types. First, you have political revolutions. These are popular uprisings involving extra-legal mass actions, often violent, yes. But crucially, they bring about a fundamental change in the political system itself. The rules, the institutions, not just a displacement of one ruling elite by another or a simple policy change. This distinguishes them from a mere coup d'etat, which is usually a seizure of power by a small band, often from within the existing elite, or from a more limited rebellion or revolt, which might seek specific concessions without overthrowing the whole system.
Okay, so political revolution changes the system. What else?
Then there are social revolutions. These, particularly in Marxist theory, are seen as even more fundamental. They involve changes in the system of ownership or the economic system itself, changes in the mode of production, as Marx called it.
Like feudalism to capitalism.
It's exactly. Or in their theory, capitalism eventually being replaced by communism. For Marxists, social revolutions are the truly transformative ones. They see political revolutions as often just the surface manifestations of deeper, long-term class transformations driven by economic forces. Finally, you have cultural revolutions. These involve rooting out old values, doctrines, beliefs, and establishing new ones, aiming for a profound ideological and moral shift in society. Think China's Cultural Revolution under Mao. In fact, all revolutions have a crucial cultural dimension, because any stable system of rule, old or new, must be culturally and ideologically embedded. Revolutionary regimes often consolidate power through a conscious process of re-education or propaganda to establish new, system-sustaining values.
It's clear that revolutions have profoundly shaped the modern world. What are some key historical examples that illustrate these types of change, and what theories try to explain why revolutions happen in the first place? What pushes societies over the edge?
Absolutely. The modern world has been forged through a series of crucial revolutions. The English Revolution of the 1640s-50s, which overthrew monarchical absolutism and established the foundations for constitutionalism and parliamentary power. The American Revolution of 1776, which created a constitutional republic based on popular sovereignty and gave powerful expression to the ideal of representation and self-governance. And of course, the French Revolution of 1789, which dramatically destroyed the ancien regime under the banner of liberty, equality, fraternity, advanced democratic ideals, and arguably sparked an age of revolution across early 19th century Europe and beyond.
And in the 20th century.
The Russian Revolution of 1917, the first major communist revolution, then provided a potent model for many of the subsequent 20th century communist revolutions. The Chinese Revolution of 1949, the Cuban Revolution of 1959, the Vietnamese Revolution, the Nicaraguan Revolution. It had a huge global impact.
Okay, so those are the examples. What about the causes? Why do they happen?
As for general theories on causes, several stand out in the literature. Marxist theory, as mentioned, sees revolutions as essentially social phenomena arising from inherent contradictions and exploitation present in all class-based societies. They are driven by economic forces and class struggle. Systems theorists offer a different perspective. They argue revolution results from disequilibrium in the political system. This occurs when economic, social, cultural, or international changes happen that the existing systems simply can't respond to effectively. Governmental outputs no longer match the inputs or demands from society, leading to breakdown.
The system can't cope.
Exactly. Then there's the influential idea of a revolution of rising expectations. This suggests revolutions are most likely to occur not when things are at their absolute worst, but when a period of economic and social improvement is abruptly reversed. This creates a widening, unbearable gap between popular expectations for a better life and the government's perceived capabilities to deliver, leading to profound frustration and revolt. And finally, there's the social structural explanation. This focuses on the state itself. Regimes usually succumb to revolution when, often due to international weakness or domestic incompetence, they lose the ability or the political will to maintain control coercively. The state's repressive apparatus falters, leaving it vulnerable to challenge from below.
The consequences of revolution are also a source of deep disagreement, aren't they? What do revolutionaries typically claim they'll achieve versus what their critics often point out happens in reality? It rarely seems to go as planned.
No, it rarely does. Revolutionaries almost always argue that revolution is inherently popular, the unleashing of democratic pressure from below. They portray it as a purifying, ennobling struggle against corruption, oppression, and injustice. They often subscribe to some form of utopianism, believing it will lead to a fundamentally better, more just, or more free society.
The dream.
The dream. Critics, however, are quick to point out that revolutions invariably seem to fail to live up to these incredibly high ideals.
Why? What goes wrong?
Several reasons are suggested. Despite the images of popular revolt, revolutions are often actually brought about or hijacked by relatively small, disciplined cliques, who are then understandably unwilling to relinquish their newly won power. Moreover, regimes established by force often feel compelled to continue using force and repression to maintain control, especially against counter-revolutionaries or internal dissent. This can lead to authoritarianism and a cycle of violence, betraying the initial liberation goals. And critically, revolutions often dismantle or crucially weaken existing institutions, courts, bureaucracies, social structures, leaving leaders with potentially unchecked power in the resulting vacuum. There are fewer constraints.
Power corrupts.
That's certainly part of the argument. It raises a really important and perhaps tragic question. Is true lasting liberation genuinely possible through such violent upheaval? Or does it inevitably sow the seeds of new forms of oppression, simply replacing one tyranny with another?
That's a sobering thought indeed. Okay, next, let's explore populism. This term has become incredibly common in recent political discourse, almost ubiquitous. It's often used to describe everything from charismatic leaders to specific social movements. What is it in its essence?
Yes, it's everywhere now. Populism, from the Latin populus meaning the people, describes both a political tradition and distinctive political movements. As a tradition, it reflects the belief that the instincts and wishes of the people, often conceived as a unified, virtuous entity, provide the principal, legitimate guide to political action. It asserts a kind of collective, common-sense wisdom residing in the ordinary person.
Trust the people.
Right. Populist movements, then, typically claim to support the common people against what they portray as corrupt economic or political elites. They create this stark us versus them narrative. Populist politicians make a direct, often emotional appeal to the people, claiming to express their deepest hopes and fears. And they typically express distrust for all intermediary institutions, like established political parties, parliaments, the courts, even mainstream media. They see these institutions as corrupting influences, out of touch, or obstacles to the true will of the people, which the populist leader claims to uniquely understand and represent.
What's fascinating here is its intellectual connection, mentioned in the sources, to someone like Rousseau and his concept of the general will. How does that influence populism?
That's a really insightful connection. The populist political tradition can indeed be traced back, conceptually, to Rousseau's notion of a general will, the idea that there's an indivisible collective interest of society, something distinct and pure, uncorrupted by factionalism or special interests. Populism thus aims to establish an unmediated, direct link between a leader and his or her people. Through this link, the leader supposedly gives expression to their innermost hopes and dreams, representing their authentic, unified voice, bypassing those distrusted intermediaries.
So the leader is the people's voice.
That's the claim. Populist leadership can be found in its most developed and dangerous form in totalitarian dictatorships operating through charismatic leaders who claim to embody the nation's destiny. But it also appears within democratic systems. You see leaders who cultivate a personal image and ideological vision that is deliberately separate from, and perhaps positioned above, traditional parties, parliaments, and other government institutions. They run against the system, even while seeking to lead it. And the wider use of tools like focus groups, social media, and increasingly sophisticated political presentation, especially by spin doctors who craft public images, has given greater impetus to this style of populism in modern politics generally. It allows leaders to cultivate that sense of direct connection and bypass traditional media gatekeepers.
Is there any defense for populism, or is it mostly criticized for its potentially negative implications for democracy?
Well, if defended, it's usually on the basis that it constitutes a genuine, more authentic form of democracy. The argument is that those intermediate institutions, parties, parliament, media, tend to pervert or misrepresent the people's true will. Therefore, a direct connection, free from elite influence, is more legitimate.
Cutting out the middleman.
Exactly. More commonly, however, populism is criticized on two main grounds. First, it's seen as implicitly authoritarian. It provides little basis for challenging the leader's claim to articulate the genuine interests of the people, because the leader's pronouncements often become treated as unchallengeable representations of the collective will. Dissent becomes betrayal of the people. Very. Second, it's argued that it debases politics, both by giving expression to perhaps the crudest hopes and fears of the masses, appealing to emotion, resentment, prejudice over reason, and by leaving little scope for deliberation, compromise, and rational analysis. It prioritizes raw sentiment over reasoned debate and evidence-based policy. Thus, populist democracy is often seen by critics as the enemy of both pluralist democracy, with its competing groups, and parliamentary democracy, with its emphasis on deliberation and representation. It bypasses the checks, balances, and diverse representations these systems are designed to promote.
It really makes you think.
It does. It raises an important question for any society experiencing a rise in populism. When does giving voice to the people, or at least a segment claiming to be the people, become a threat to nuanced policy, minority rights, and reasoned debate? When does it start undermining the very democratic processes it claims to embody?
A critical question. Finally, let's explore militarism. This also seems like a concept that can take on different meanings and manifest in various ways, not just military rule. What does it describe?
It does have a couple of meanings. The term militarism can be used in two main ways. First, simply as the achievement of ends by the use of military force, any attempt to solve problems primarily through military means, a reliance on coercion or the threat of it.
Using the army to get things done.
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
Second, and perhaps more commonly in political analysis, it's understood as a cultural and ideological phenomena. This is where military priorities, ideals, and values come to pervade the larger society, influencing civilian life, political thought, national identity, even things like education and popular culture.
And what does that cultural and ideological sense of militarism specifically entail for a society? What does it look like?
This typically includes things like the glorification of the armed forces and military heroes, a heightened, often aggressive sense of national patriotism, the acceptance or even celebration of war as a legitimate, perhaps even necessary or purifying instrument of national policy, and often an atavistic belief in heroism, discipline, obedience, and self-sacrifice for the nation. In some, but not all cases, it's characterized by the military actually abusing its legitimate functions and usurping responsibilities normally ascribed to civilian politicians, leading to direct military involvement in or control over government. But the cultural aspect can exist even without a formal military takeover.
So it's a common feature of military regimes, obviously, but also totalitarian dictatorships, as you mentioned earlier. How does it function in those contexts?
Yes. The defining feature of direct military rule is, of course, that armed forces members displace civilian politicians. They fill leading government posts, and the structure often reflects the military chain of command. Military rule itself can take various forms. It could be a collective military government, a junta, or it could be a single individual dictatorship led by a military figure, like Colonel Papadopoulos in Greece, General Pinochet in Chile, or General Abacha in Nigeria were examples. Or it can be more subtle, situations where the military pulls the strings behind the scenes, while civilians retain formal power, exerting decisive influence without direct, visible control. The military as the ultimate arbiter.
How does militarism as an ideology help legitimize military control? And how do charismatic leaders, even civilian ones, often use it to consolidate their power?
Well, in direct military regimes, militarism as an ideology directly legitimizes the military's control of political life. It presents the military as the most disciplined, patriotic, efficient, and incorruptible force for national good, often arguing it's the only entity capable of restoring order, fighting corruption, or ensuring national survival against internal or external enemies.
The saviors of the nation.
That's the narrative. In totalitarian dictatorships, charismatic leaders like Mussolini, Hitler, Saddam Hussein, even if not military figures themselves initially, used militarism more subtly but very effectively to consolidate power. By doing things like wearing military uniforms, constantly associating with the armed forces, using martial rhetoric and metaphors in their speeches, they attempted to imbue their regimes and societies with military values: discipline, obedience, unity, a heightened sense of collective purpose. This was usually linked to intense, often chauvinist nationalism, creating a sense of shared destiny and mobilizing the population against perceived threats.
Is it always effective?
Well, the sources suggest that militarism as a mechanism of regime consolidation is likely most effective in contexts of actual war or intensifying international conflict. It needs a plausible enemy. This is demonstrated by its invariable accompaniment by terroristic policing and widespread repression to maintain control, especially once the external threat diminishes or proves illusory. Marxists have also highlighted a potential link between militarism and the sense of a disposition towards war and maintaining high levels of defense spending and capitalism.
How so?
They argue that high defense spending, often justified by regular military interventions or perceived threats, ensures buoyant domestic demand and high profit levels for certain key industries, military-industrial complex. They see it as an economic driver, even a necessity, for sustaining certain forms of capitalism. This raises a final important question for us to consider. Is militarism an inevitable byproduct of certain political or economic systems? Or is it a conscious choice that societies make, one that could potentially be avoided through alternative approaches to national security, diplomacy, and economic development?
Another deep question to ponder. #Tax 6. Conclusion, recap, and provocative thought. Wow, what an incredible journey we've taken today. From the absolute rule of monarchs centuries ago, through the chilling reach of totalitarianism, to the intricate, often messy bands of modern democracies, and then looking at those powerful shaping forces like revolution, populism, and militarism, it's undeniably clear that political systems are far more complex and intertwined than their simple labels often suggest.
Absolutely. We've seen how these concepts, absolutism, authoritarianism, capitalism, liberal democracy, pluralism, elitism, patriarchy, and so many more, aren't just dry academic terms confined to textbooks. They describe the fundamental operating systems of societies. They define freedoms, distribute power, allocate resources, and ultimately shape the very fabric of our lives in profound ways. The distinctions, the nuances, the overlaps, even the contradictions we've uncovered matter deeply for understanding the world around us and for making sense of the political currents and headlines we encounter every single day.
Our goal today was really to give you a true shortcut to being well-informed, to provide those moments where seemingly disparate ideas click into place, where the definitions truly come alive and connect to reality.
And, perhaps most importantly, to encourage critical thinking. The material constantly reminds us that even in seemingly stable, established systems, the seas of other forms of governance or societal pressures are always present, always challenging our assumptions, always pushing for change or reacting against it. Nothing is ever static in politics or society.
So true. So here's a final provocative thought for you, our listeners, to carry forward from today's deep dive. How aware are you really of the subtle authoritarian or perhaps elitist traits that might exist even in the seemingly democratic structures right around us in our own communities or nations?
Or that ongoing, often hidden tension between individual freedom and societal order that exists really in any system.
And what surprising unseen hands, be they economic forces, cultural assumptions, or resurgent ideologies, might be shaping our own political reality right now that perhaps we're yet to fully name or understand?
Food for thought.
Definitely. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into understanding the operating systems of societies. We hope you feel a little more well-informed and perhaps even a lot more curious about the world you live in.